Well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for a clawback farmer meeting to think and discuss some mechanisms and strategies to protect farmers from buyer bankruptcy. My name is Julia Barton. Several of my colleagues are here. Lily Hawkins and I will be collaborating to share this presentation with you, but I'm sure we'll all be piping in here during discussion time. We'll just move forward and take a look at our agenda. So we'll talk a little bit about Organic Farmers Association, discuss buyer bankruptcy clawbacks, some recent examples, think a little bit about farmer strategies to protect oneself from these bankruptcy clawbacks, and then get into some policy ideas for some potential mechanisms for farmer protection. And then we should have plenty of time for discussion. So who is OFA? And we can just continue right to that next slide because OFA is, we are farmers. OFA was created by organic farmers for organic farmers to provide a strong national voice on organic farmer issues. And we are grateful to those of you who are members. If you are not already an OFA member, we would welcome your membership. And my colleague will pop a membership link in the chat. And we'll also follow up with these links after the fact if you're not a person who likes to follow links during the webinar. But the more of us who join together to advocate on behalf of organic farmers, the better luck that we'll have. And we'd be grateful for your partnership in that. We'll also just share briefly several different ways that we have to get involved with OFA. So we have a number of farmer circles, which are held monthly on Zoom. And my colleague Harriet Bihar, who's here, facilitates one of those. We have another circle that's going as well. And these are community spaces, spaces for support and learning and community, and you'd be welcome in them. There's a link of that also popping up in the chat. And we also have a number of work groups. These are some of the topics of work groups that we have going currently. We're also hoping to start a few more. So if these are of interest to you, we'd love to have you join us. Our work groups are intended to identify topics of importance or barriers to getting the work done that organic farmers are trying to do, and then to identify farmer-driven solutions to those barriers so that the solutions are making sense to the people on the ground. And then we can run those through the policy process. So today we are here to talk about buyer bankruptcy clawbacks. So we'll get started on that. There are a couple of recent examples of clawbacks that have transpired. You can just move us right to that next one. Thank you, Nancy. You might remember the pipeline food bankruptcy, which was filed in 2021. That was the clawback letters for which arrived in July 2022. Mostly farmers from the upper Midwest were impacted by the pipeline clawback, and we don't have data on the exact number of farmers impacted, nor do we have data on the total amount that was clawed back. But we did just recently get some contact information for some of the farmers. So we're hoping to reach out to them about these potential ideas for addressing clawbacks moving forward. More recently, however, there was the global processing bankruptcy in 2022. It was filed, and the clawback letters were just sent this past fall. So folks in September through December of fall and beginning of winter 2024 experienced these clawback letters. Over $5.5 million was requested to be returned, and more than 90 farmers were impacted in the states you see here: Iowa, Minnesota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kentucky, even Kansas and Missouri. And beyond just the farmers that were impacted, we also became aware through this process that a number of brokers and truckers and others were also impacted by the clawback. So it reached even further than, at least than I initially realized. So what are these clawback letters? All payments that are made to those that are selling to the company that filed for bankruptcy within 90 days previous to that filing can be subject to paying back all or some of what they were paid for the grain that was delivered, which sounds crazy. Um, the idea is that they're trying to make whole as many parties as possible. So this is like, believe it or not, a totally legal, totally normal part of bankruptcy law. So the money is then intended to be gathered and spread among those who are owed money by the bankrupt company. A trustee is appointed to oversee the clawback. Those folks are not usually looking for that job. It is an appointment, and like a duty that they are then asked to fulfill. So for example, in the global processing situation, the trustee worked with OFA to get us contact information so that we could be in touch with the farmers that were impacted and provide education. The same was not true for the pipeline bankruptcy, but we're hoping to get in touch with those folks now. And then just again to note that the clawback letters can be mailed up to 2 years after that bankruptcy filing date, which is a
Could I
very,
just clarify one thing, Julia?
yes, please, Harriet.
That when the money is collected and then redistributed, there are some entities that are more equal than others. And so there are like preferred creditors. So if I give some money back, maybe I'm helping out some other farmers. Most likely that money will go first to banks that had lines of credit and that kind of thing, because there's certain entities that um, are first in line. So it's not everyone who is owed money by the bankrupt company is equal in the eyes of the bankruptcy court.
Thank you. There's a lot of information on our website about these clawback letters and how to respond to them. And we will drop a link if it hasn't already been dropped in the chat. But some of the things to keep in mind should one receive a clawback letter is to answer promptly and ask for an extension. So buy yourself some time, but do meet the deadlines for communication. Do not send money until a settlement has been negotiated. Some folks mistakenly think that it's just a requirement to pay everything back and don't realize that it's a negotiation. It is absolutely a negotiation. And so while it is part of the legal bankruptcy process, there's room to negotiate. So Harriet noted here that most people pay 15 to 50% of what was asked for in the original clawback number, the clawback letter. We know folks who have paid 2%. We also know folks who've paid a lot more. So just keep in mind that there is a range and negotiation as possible. Also, it's very helpful to find an attorney who knows complex bankruptcy law. And also, I've heard small business law is really helpful in this context. So when one responds then to the trustee, an argument that is a good argument to use and can be helpful in this situation is to note that the payment that was received for the product that delivered was not preferential. It was done in the ordinary course of business. And then one sort of superpower that organic farmers have is that they tend to keep pretty good records because they're required to. So one can demonstrate the ordinary course of business through documentation of those deliveries and those slips. Other things to think about to protect oneself from buyer bankruptcy is to sell in smaller deliveries over a longer period of time. This would then help one to demonstrate ordinary course of business, like this is a regular transaction. Being aware of various resources that could be helpful to you in the event that you should find yourself in this situation, like state indemnity or bond funds. And then also being aware of the entities and the rules related to grain sales, where you live or in the state to which you're shipping. Selling to multiple buyers, diversification of markets can be helpful, just like a diverse crop rotation can be helpful. And then paying attention to warning signs. And I have heard these warning signs from some of you prior to some of these bankruptcies taking place. Like, this seems too good to be true. You might recall that with some of these situations. This price doesn't seem right. That's way higher than everybody else is getting for this same product. Um, or also behaviors like consistently late payments can be a red flag, or suddenly late payments, right? When consistency has been in place previously. It may be that smaller payments might not be clawed back as readily. However, we have heard from people over time, the large amounts of clawback letters were issued earlier in October in the case of this September and October in the case of this global processing bankruptcy filing or clawback letter disbursement. But we then heard from people later on into the winter who had smaller amounts that were then being clawed back. So it may be that they start with the larger amounts and move on to the smaller amounts. It may be that if the payments were smaller, it might not be clawed back as readily. These are strategies to consider. Another point is that many states have indemnity funds. But those funds are limited. So we've seen those funds be completely drawn down in these situations, which is really concerning and also another reason to think about other solutions. But there are also examples where state departments of ag have been very helpful. So for example, here, Minnesota stopped Pipeline Foods from requiring farmers to deliver grain that was on contract after the bankruptcy was filed. So yeah, exploring those allies. Other ideas for marketing strategies, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but if it's possible to sell direct to other farmers, sell through a co-op, direct to a processor, or direct to a broker. Although, again, we do know that some brokers were also impacted by these clawbacks. And then really paying close attention to the small print on the expectations of contracts, um, quality considerations. You have the ability to ask for storage fees if there's delivery beyond the fall harvest. Selling, as we discussed already, to multiple buyers if possible. And then requiring a short time frame between delivery and payment. Some states have really nice, tight laws on that front, and knowing what the laws are in your state or in the state to which you're shipping is good information to have as you're preparing to sell. So at this point, with this context of these two examples of recent clawbacks, OFA is now exploring mechanisms for farmer protection beyond those we've already discussed. So, and Lily Hawkins is here, our policy director, who will walk us through what some of these potential solutions are. And then we will lose the video and recording and have a discussion to hear from you all what you think about these potential solutions. So I'll pass it to you, Lily.
Thanks, Julia. Yeah, so Julia and our farmer services team did an excellent job responding to this crisis and helping farmers figure out how to cope and putting together a really great collection of resources. And now, over the past couple of months, we've sort of transitioned to looking for policy solutions that could help hopefully stop farmers from getting clawback letters in the first place, or at least help put protections in place if a bankruptcy like this was to occur and impact farmers. So we've been having a lot of conversations with members of Congress, folks that work at USDA, other organizations to try to determine what some of those solutions could look like. And Nancy, you can go to the next slide anytime. None of us at OFA are experts in bankruptcy law, so it was a lot of learning that we had to do and a lot of conversations with people. But we've kind of started to see that the possible solutions fall into sort of two buckets. One would be finding a way to exclude farmers and ranchers from these kind of clawback letters. And that would mean advocating for changes to bankruptcy code. which would be a very uphill battle, we think, politically. Doesn't mean that it can't happen, but there would be a lot of other industries saying, well, if farmers can be exempt, why can't we? So we haven't gotten a ton of excitement about that kind of angle of approach from members of Congress that we have talked to. The other angle that, or the other bucket of solutions would be to create a federal trust that would be in place to protect farmers if something like this happens. And there's a couple of those that already exist um, for different kinds of crops and livestock. The Perishable Agricultural Commodities Act contains a trust. We call it the PACA trust. It's the acronym. And then there's also a trust in the Packers and Stockyards Act. Nancy, you can go to the next slide. And they both have kind of some pros and cons, but we've been looking at ways to draw from those two existing trusts for ideas of something that could be set up for organic and non-GMO grain farmers, and talking to members of Congress and folks at USDA who oversee these trusts to find out more details about them and what might work there. It's confusing that the names sound very similar, but the first one we're going to talk about is the PACA Trust. And again, that's stands for the Perishable Agricultural Commodities Act. This is a trust that gives sellers of fresh and frozen fruits and vegetables priority status if their buyers were to go bankrupt. So it does protect the producers of fresh and frozen fruits and vegetables, and it doesn't only protect farmers, also grocer or like wholesalers or anybody who sold fresh, perishable produce could take advantage of this. And it works about both if the company that you sold to didn't pay you because they went bankrupt, or if that you pay, they do pay you and then they try to claw it back. This is, been a lot of learning for me to learn about trusts. But so if the business were to go bankrupt, the assets that they're trying to get back for all the money that they owe can't be accessed to give out to their various creditors until the members of the trust have been paid or not paid or not forced to do the clawback. I think something that I think this is a great model for us generally. We work with a number of farmers who have used this program, who sell fruits and vegetables, and it's supposed to be a very good program, and people have had good success using it. The thing to know is that it is funded by a user fee. That's how they have the money to give out. That's just under $1,000 annually to participate in the trust. They call it, you become a licensee of the trust. I think I wonder, and this is something that it will take more research, but are there enough producers of organic and non-GMO grain to successfully fund something like this, and would farmers find it advantageous to pay this fee? Are questions that I think when we enter the discussion phase of this conversation, I'd love to hear more about. And then the other trust we're looking at is the Packer Trust, and this is to protect livestock sellers. This was established after a big crisis in the American meat industry that left a lot of producers owed millions and millions of dollars. And it requires the buyer, it's secured by the federal government, paid through appropriations, but then that also takes money from the buyer of the livestock. And they basically can't use the proceeds from a resale of that animal or whatever until the sellers have been paid. So if the money, and I'm sorry, feel free to ask questions, or some of you may know as much as I do about bankruptcy law, but the assets in the trust are not considered bankruptcy assets. So if you have assets and you go bankrupt, if they're trust assets, you can't use those to repay your debtors. And I like that this one is paid for through the federal government, but it means it would be a little harder of a political project to get something like that written into law. Next slide. So I think pretty soon we're going to transition into discussion. one thing we heard from folks at USDA is that when there is a trust like the PACA trust or the Packer trust in place, it really helps them to be aware of what's going on with bankruptcies earlier in the process, because they're hearing about folks who aren't getting paid through that trust mechanism, and it helps them be a little more on top of what's going on in the market. Couple concerns. I did talk to a few other groups who are not specific to organic and non-GMO, and they said that these kind of buyer bankruptcies are very, very rare in the conventional world. And we think that's because the conventional grain market is much older and not growing as quickly, and so it's more stable and less exciting, but also maybe less risky than the organic market. So I have wondered if there'll be enough money from just the organic and non-GMO producers to run a user-funded trust like the PACA trust. And I think that's something that we'll be doing a little bit more work on figuring out. That kind would, like I said, be easier to get Congress to put in place because they won't have to fork out money for it. And we've been having a lot of conversations, as I said, with different offices. However, those are still ongoing. And if you are a farmer who's been affected by the bankruptcy clawback, we would love to work with you to meet with your legislator to discuss the situation and kind of help brainstorm with them what solutions we might be able to put in place. Before we move to discussion, we do have a couple quick action items that are related. One, you may have heard we're working on a piece of legislation to reduce import fraud in organic feedstuffs. And it's called the Organic Import Verification Act. It has not yet been introduced, but we are hoping that it'll be introduced very soon. It would give NOP more authority to both identify high-risk feedstuffs and then require testing for residues of pesticides or other things not allowed in organic production at the point of entry. Like if there's a container ship coming into the port, they would have more power to test the product on board. It would require USDA to write an annual report determining which are the highest risk imports and put a plan in place for testing those. We see it as SOE, that Strengthening Organic Enforcement Rule, has done a lot to help prevent organic fraud, and this is like the next step would be just a little bit of extra power for NOP to really look into an issue if they were suspicious of fraud. The office working on this bill is Senator Ricketts' office in Nebraska. They are still looking for a Democratic sponsor, and they've been talking, I know, to Minnesota Senator Smith, but I don't know how committed they are to that office. And if this is something you're interested in, feel free to let me or Julia know, and we can help you set up a conversation with your members of Congress. And we do have a petition circulating, which Julia has put in the chat. If you click there, you can sign the petition. Once the bill is introduced, we would love to have a really long list of names on the petition so that we can share it with legislative offices as we're asking them to support the bill. It's really helpful for them to be able to see the public support for it. So please sign the petition and feel free to circulate it within your community. It is open to farmers, consumers, folks who work at organizations, and certifiers, really any member of the organic community. We'd be happy to have them sign that.